The sirens blared through the quiet street, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the buildings as the ambulance rushed toward its destination. The paramedics inside were laser-focused. Every second counted in an emergency. But just as they neared a crucial turn, something unexpected happened. A dog, a scruffy brown Labrador mix, stood firm in the middle of the road, blocking their path. He wasn't barking or running in fear. He wasn't aggressive or lost. He just stood there, unwavering, refusing to move. The driver honked. Nothing. The paramedics yelled out the window. No reaction. The dog's deep brown eyes were locked onto them with an intensity that sent shivers down their spines. This wasn't just any random stray dog. There was something different about him, something desperate. It was as if he knew exactly what he was doing. The paramedics had seen their fair share of strange encounters while responding to emergencies, but this was new. Animals usually ran from the sound of sirens, but this one? He was stopping them on purpose. The situation became more urgent. They had a patient in the back, a man fighting for his life. They couldn't afford to waste time. One of the paramedics stepped out, trying to shoo the dog away, but instead of running off, the dog did something incredible. He turned and took a few steps forward, then stopped and looked back. His message was clear. "Follow me." The paramedics exchanged a glance. Was this some bizarre coincidence, or was the dog actually trying to lead them somewhere? They didn't have time for games, but there was something about this dog, something in his eyes that made them hesitate. He wasn't just stalling them. He was pleading. What they did next would change everything. Because this dog, he wasn't blocking them to be a nuisance. He wasn't confused or scared. He was trying to save a life. And when the paramedics finally followed him, they discovered something that no one could have expected. And that's when the Real story begins. The paramedics standing outside the ambulance hesitated for only a moment before making a split-second decision. The dog wasn't moving out of the way, and there was something in his eyes, a silent urgency that couldn't be ignored. With a sharp breath, he turned back to his partner in the driver's seat and shouted, "Just give me a second." The driver clenched the wheel, glancing at the clock. Every second counted. But something about this situation didn't feel random. The dog stood there, watching, waiting, his tail stiff, his ears perked. Then suddenly the dog took off, not running away, but leading. A few quick steps forward, then he turned back, as if making sure they were following. The paramedic hesitated only a moment before chasing after him. "I'll be right back," he yelled to his partner. The driver swore under his breath, gripping the wheel. Their patient in the back was stable for now, but there was no telling how long that would last. Time was slipping away, yet something told him that this wasn't just some lost dog playing a game. There was a reason for this. The dog led the paramedic down a narrow alleyway just off the road. It was dark, quiet, almost eerie. The city noises faded behind him, replaced by a strange, heavy silence. His boots pounded against the pavement as he kept up with the dog, who was now moving faster, more desperate. Then he saw it, just a few feet ahead. Crumpled on the ground beside an old brick wall was a man. He wasn't moving. His clothes were torn, his face pale. The paramedic's heart pounded as he rushed forward, dropping to his knees. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck. A pulse. Weak, but there. He grabbed his radio. "I need backup." Unresponsive male. Alleyway off Cedar Street. Breathing, but barely. The dog circled them, whining softly, his paws shifting anxiously on the pavement. He wasn't leaving. He stayed close, his eyes never leaving the unconscious man. The paramedic checked the man's body for injuries. There was no obvious bleeding, but his breathing was shallow, his skin clammy. Overdose? A head injury? It was impossible to tell in the dim light. Seconds later, the ambulance's sirens roared as it reversed down the alleyway. The driver had made the call. This was bigger than their original plan. The patient in the back was stable, and they were close to the hospital, but this man, he wouldn't last much longer without help. The second paramedic jumped out, carrying the gear they needed. They worked fast, oxygen mask, vitals check, stabilizing his condition. The dog sat beside them, ears low, as if he understood the weight of the moment. Then, as the paramedics lifted the man onto the stretcher, the dog did something no one expected. He jumped up, placing his front paws on the stretcher, refusing to let go. He's with him, the first paramedic realized. His throat tightened as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just any dog. This was his dog. The paramedics exchanged glances, and without a word, they made the decision. "Bring him," the driver said. "Let's go." The dog didn't need to be told twice. He jumped into the ambulance and curled up beside the stretcher, never taking his eyes off his human. As they sped toward the hospital, the paramedics worked quickly, monitoring both patients, one unconscious, one unwavering. The mystery deepened. Who was this man? What had happened to him? And how did his dog know to stop the ambulance, to bring them here in time? The answers were still unknown, but one thing was clear. This dog had just done something extraordinary. He had saved a life, and this story was far from over. The ambulance raced through the city streets, sirens wailing, lights flashing against the dark sky. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly, checking the unconscious man's vitals, adjusting his oxygen, making sure his heart kept beating. But there was something else in the air, something unspoken, a presence that didn't belong but felt completely right. The dog sat pressed against the stretcher, his body tense, his ears flicking at every movement. His eyes, deep and full of something that almost looked like fear, never left the man's face. Every now and then, he let out a soft whimper, barely audible over the hum of the ambulance. He knew. He understood what was happening. One of the paramedics, a woman with years of experience, glanced down at the dog. "I've never seen anything like this," she murmured. He knew. He knew where to find us. Her partner, still focused on the patient, shook his head in quiet disbelief. "That's not just a pet. That's family." The dog shifted slightly, placing his head gently on the man's arm. The simple action sent a lump into the paramedic's throat. There was loyalty here, devotion beyond words. The hospital came into view, and within seconds, the ambulance pulled up to the emergency bay. The back doors swung open, and the team moved quickly, rolling the stretcher out. The dog jumped down instantly, but as they pushed the man toward the entrance, hospital staff rushed forward, stopping the dog in his tracks. "I'm sorry," a nurse said, blocking his path. "No animals allowed past this point." The dog froze, his tail still, his body unmoving. The paramedic who had followed him into the alley crouched down, reaching out. "Hey, buddy, we'll take care of him," he said softly. "He's in good hands." But the dog didn't move. His eyes darted from the man, disappearing through the double doors to the paramedic, pleading, desperate. The nurse sighed, sympathy in her expression. "Someone should call animal control," she said. "He might be a stray." The words stung more than expected. Stray? No. This dog wasn't lost. He had a home. It was just lying unconscious on a hospital stretcher. "I'll stay with him," the paramedic said quickly. Just give me a second." The team disappeared inside, leaving him alone with the dog. He pulled out his phone, fingers hesitating over the screen. Who was this man? Did he have family? Friends? Someone who was missing him? The dog clearly belonged to him, but without ID, without any information, there were no easy answers. He crouched lower, rubbing the dog's head gently. "We'll figure this out," he whispered. "I promise." The dog finally moved, just slightly. He nudged the paramedic's hand, as if placing his trust in him. Inside the hospital, doctors and nurses worked quickly to stabilize the man, running tests, trying to understand what had happened to him. The paramedics could only wait, hoping for answers. And outside, under the harsh glow of hospital lights, a loyal dog sat quietly, his eyes never leaving the doors, waiting for his best friend to come back. The automatic hospital doors slid open and shut, people coming and going, but the dog never moved from his spot. His paws were firmly planted on the cold pavement, his eyes fixed on the entrance, waiting for the only person that mattered to him. The paramedic stood beside him, arms crossed, watching the way the dog barely blinked, his breath steady but tense, as if he knew that what happened inside those walls would change everything. Minutes stretched into an hour. The paramedic had seen dogs before, strays wandering the streets, pets anxiously pacing in waiting rooms. But this was different. This wasn't just an animal waiting for its owner. This was something deeper, something unbreakable. The connection between the two had already defied logic once tonight. and somehow, he knew it wasn't over yet. He pulled out his phone, trying again to find any information about the man they had brought in. No ID, no wallet, just a faded jacket, worn-out jeans, and a dog with more determination than he had ever seen. The hospital had him listed as a John Doe, and so far, no one had come looking for him. The paramedic knelt beside the dog, running a hand over his head. "You got to give me something, buddy. A name, a direction, anything." The dog only let out a slow breath, then turned his head, staring at the entrance again. The doors opened once more, and this time, a nurse stepped outside, rubbing her arms against the cold. "Still out here?" she asked, her voice gentle. "Yeah," the paramedic said. "Won't move." The nurse exhaled, glancing down at the dog. "I don't think you'll convince him to leave." She hesitated, shifting on her feet. "He's still unconscious," she continued, lowering her voice. "Vitals are better, but the doctors are trying to figure out what happened to him. No visible injuries, no ID. Nothing. Just collapsed in that alleyway." The paramedic frowned. "Could be anything, dehydration, exhaustion, maybe something worse." The nurse nodded. "They'll keep running tests. But if no one claims him, and he wakes up confused," she trailed off. The unspoken possibility hung in the air. If the man had no memory, if no one knew who he was, if the system failed to find a connection, what would happen to him? As if sensing the shift in conversation, the dog suddenly stood up. His ears twitched, his tail stiffened, and he took a single step toward the doors. Then another, then another. His body language changed in an instant, alert, focused, almost frantic. His nose lifted, his breath quickened, and without warning, he let out a sharp bark. The paramedic shot to his feet just as the nurse's radio crackled to life. A rushed voice came through, something about the John Doe. His heart pounded as he turned back to the dog, who was already pushing forward, his instincts pulling him inside. Something was happening, and it wasn't good. Inside the hospital, alarms beeped, voices rose, and the atmosphere shifted from routine urgency to something more pressing. The paramedic didn't need to be told twice. He followed the dog's lead, stepping inside just as a group of nurses rushed past. "What's going on?" he called out. His heart rates dropping, one of the nurses replied without stopping. "He's crashing." The words sent a chill down his spine. The man they had barely saved once was slipping away again. The paramedic turned back toward the dog, who was already pulling against an invisible barrier, his nails scraping the tile floor. He whined, low and desperate, his whole body trembling with the need to reach the man he had fought so hard to save. "I can't take him back there," the paramedic muttered, mostly to himself. The dog let out another sharp bark, then did something no one expected. He lunged. Not in fear, not in aggression, but in pure desperation. The leash looped hastily around his neck slipped free as he bolted toward the hallway, dodging the legs of passing doctors and nurses. "Hey, stop him," someone shouted. But no one could. He was too fast, too determined. The paramedic rushed after him, heart pounding. He wasn't sure what he was witnessing. Instinct, fate, something else entirely, but the dog knew. Somehow he knew. By the time the paramedic reached the room, the scene was chaos. A team of doctors worked frantically around the bed, calling out vitals, pushing medications, trying everything they could to stabilize the man. And then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, the dog skidded to a stop just at the edge of the chaos. No one noticed him at first, but he didn't need permission. He leapt forward, landing with his front paws on the hospital bed, his face just inches from the man's. Then, something extraordinary happened. The dog let out a single soft whimper, barely a sound. He nudged the man's hand with his nose, his whole body trembling. The room, once filled with frantic noise, seemed to hold its breath. And then, against all odds, the monitor let out a single, steady beep. Then another. Then another. The paramedics and doctors exchanged glances, disbelief flickering in their eyes. The man's vitals were stabilizing. His heart, moments ago fading, was now fighting back. The dog didn't move. He just rested his head against the man's chest, as if he had known all along that he was the missing piece. The paramedic, still standing at the doorway, swallowed hard. He had seen a lot in his time, tragedy, miracles, everything in between. But this was something else. And as the beeping of the monitors grew steadier, the tension in the room eased, but the real questions remained unanswered. Who was this man? And what was the story that had led this dog to save him? Again? The room stayed silent for a long moment, everyone processing what had just happened. The dog didn't move, his head still resting gently against the man's chest, as if making sure he was really there. The beeping of the monitors, once erratic and alarming, had settled into a slow, steady rhythm. A quiet kind of miracle had just unfolded in front of them, and no one could quite find the words to explain it. The lead doctor exhaled, shaking his head. "I don't know what just happened," he muttered under his breath, "but whatever it was, it worked." The paramedic, still standing in the doorway, let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He had spent years in emergency situations, witnessing life hang in the balance, but he had never seen anything like this. There had been something unspoken, something beyond medical explanation in the way this dog had fought to stay by his human side. It was more than just instinct. It was love in its purest, most unshakable form. One of the nurses crouched down beside the dog, speaking softly. "Hey, buddy, you did good." She hesitated before glancing at the doctors. "Can he stay?" There was a pause. Hospitals had rules. No animals in patient rooms. But after what they had all just witnessed, not a single person was willing to remove him. The doctor sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "As long as he doesn't cause trouble," he said finally. "But only for tonight." The dog didn't need to be told twice. He curled up at the foot of the bed, his eyes never straying from the man's face. Hours passed, and the hospital quieted as the late-night shift settled in. The paramedic found himself sitting in a chair just outside the room, unable to leave just yet. Something about this story wasn't finished. Then, just past midnight movement, a soft cough, a shift of fingers. The paramedic sat up straighter, watching as the man in the bed stirred, his eyelids fluttering. The dog lifted his head instantly, ears perking. And then, slowly, groggily, the man opened his eyes. For a moment, confusion filled his gaze. He blinked at the ceiling, then at the wires and tubes connected to him. His breathing was uneven, unsure. But when his eyes landed on the dog, everything changed. His lips parted, his throat dry. The first thing he managed to say wasn't "Where am I?" or "What happened?" It was a name. Max. The dog jumped to his feet in an instant, tail wagging so fast it blurred. A broken, relieved whimper escaped him as he climbed onto the bed, burying his face against his owner's side. The man weakly lifted a hand, resting it in the fur at Max's neck. The paramedic stood, watching quietly. Something heavy lifted in his chest. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment that made everything else make sense. The man swallowed, his voice rough from disuse. "Where?" "You collapsed," the paramedic said gently, stepping forward. "In an alleyway. Max found us, blocked our ambulance, made us follow him." He gave a small, disbelieving shake of his head. "I don't think you'd be here without him." The man blinked, trying to process everything. His gaze drifted back to Max, and something in his eyes darkened, not from confusion, but from memory. The paramedic saw it immediately. "You remember?" The man let out a slow breath. "Yeah." He hesitated, then, as if searching for the right words, "I was trying to get home. It's been rough. We don't have a place right now. But I promised Max I'd figure it out." His fingers tightened slightly in the dog's fur. "Guess my body had other plans." The paramedic's chest tightened. He had seen this story too many times. People slipping through the cracks, surviving day to day with no safety net. And yet, even in the darkest circumstances, this man had someone who refused to let him go. Max had brought him back, in more ways than one. The nurse returned a few moments later, checking vitals, updating charts, asking the routine questions. The man answered them all as best as he could, though exhaustion clung to him. He still had a long road ahead, recovery, figuring out what came next. But he wasn't alone. By morning, hospital staff had already begun making calls. Shelters, assistance programs, social workers. Someone had to know of a way to help. The paramedic made sure of it, and Max never left his side. By the time the sun rose, the story had already spread through the hospital. People whispered about the dog who had saved his owner not once, but twice. A few nurses brought food and water for Max, and someone even found an extra blanket, laying it beside the bed so he could rest more comfortably. By noon, a caseworker arrived. She sat down with the man, speaking softly, discussing options. The paramedic hovered near the doorway, listening in. A temporary shelter, a long-term plan, a chance to get back on his feet. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. As the conversation wrapped up, the man caught the paramedic's eye and gave a small, grateful nod. "Thank you," he said, "for stopping, for following him." The paramedic smiled. "It wasn't me. It was Max." The man looked down at the dog curled up beside him, his expression softening. "Yeah," he murmured. "It always is." By the time the paramedic finally left the hospital, the weight in his chest had changed. He had seen a lot of things in his career, but this wasn't just another call. This was proof of something bigger, of loyalty, of love, of second chances, and of a dog who refused to give up. As he stepped outside, breathing in the crisp afternoon air, he found himself glancing back one last time. Through the hospital window, he could see Max still curled up beside his owner, right where he belonged. And for the first time in a long time, the paramedic walked away believing that somehow everything was going to be okay.